broadcasting from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPTA 20, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome to The Gailey Show, the only daily LGBTQ radio news and talk show in the United States. I am your host, John Parker. Today is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest for the episode to help us think more clearly and more queerly on the major issues of the day facing the LGBTQ community. Coming up after us, because we know there's a lot of news happening. It seems like every day there seems to be some type of breaking news. You can get ready for the best progressive news and analysis with the Matt McNeil Show on AM 950 KTNF right after us, and Choose Views with Richard Chu on WCPT 820. Today, we're talking about LGBTQ community on the ballot. Outright International has released a report called Queering Democracy, the Global Elections in 2024 and how LGBTQI people fared. And there has been a lot of discussions, particularly in the United States, or those are the conversations I've been part of, about how LGBTQ rights, specifically trans rights, were they a reason why Trump won in 2024? Spoilers, they weren't. But last year was a super election year, according to Outright International, where there were elections in 89 countries, over 1.5 billion votes were cast. Outright International's report gives us the first global look at LGBTQ issues on the ballot in 2024 and the candidates that were running for office. My guest today is Nia Ghoshal. Neela is the Senior Director of Law, Policy, and Outreach at Outright International. Prior to that, she held multiple roles at Human Rights Watch, including Associate Director of LGBT Rights and Senior Researcher on LGBT Rights. Hello, Neela. Welcome to The Gailey Show.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
All right. Can we start with candidates that were running globally in 2024? There were a lot of them and some first-time folks that were running as well.
Yeah, there were many. And this is one of the really exciting takeaways from monitoring elections around the world in 2024. Those of us who work on queer issues full-time often feel, unfortunately, like we're dealing with a lot of negative news these days in particular. And so I think it's really important to start with this positive note that queer people were running for office around the world in numbers never seen before, as far as we know. Of course, that's also in part because nobody has really monitored this as comprehensively as we have in the past. But we do know that in many countries that we looked at, queer people, trans people were running for office for the very first time. So there were countries like the United States, Mexico, Brazil, where there were hundreds or thousands of LGBTIQ people running for office in different localities, in local government elections, parliament elections, county elections, et cetera. Really exciting and unprecedented numbers. And that's amazing. But what's also amazing to me, as someone who's spent a lot of time in places like sub-Saharan Africa for my work, is that there were countries like Botswana and Namibia where queer people were running for office for the very first time. So in both Botswana and Namibia, there were at least 2 openly queer candidates. These are 2 countries that, until a couple years ago, criminalized consensual same-sex conduct with these kind of long holdover colonial era laws that stuck around for decades and decades, making queer people legally second-class citizens. Mm-hmm. So basically, as soon as these countries, Botswana and Namibia, shed these laws, queer people stepped up and said, we are full citizens of our democracies and we're going to run for office. In those particular cases, they didn't win, but they made an impression and they opened the door for others. There were also countries like Venezuela, El Salvador, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, where there were trans people running for office. Again, many of these people were, people who had a local profile, who weren't nationally known, and often weren't capable of achieving electoral victories, but they put themselves out there and put themselves on the ballot, and were able to show that. Sorry, let me grab my earpod. They were able to show that trans people are an integral part of a democracy.
Well, I mean, I think folks like to think of the United States and Europe as these trailblazers, but we just had our very first House representative who is openly trans elected to the Congress. And so it is an ongoing, and we're finally here in the United States seeing the greatest ever numbers. It feels like every year we're having, this was the most, LGBTQ participation in electoral politics in terms of candidates running for office. So you can't make a record happen unless you get started from somewhere. I also want to be mindful as we're having this conversation, because I'm Armenian American and I'm a dual citizen of France and the US. And so I want to be very mindful about how there are stereotypes for countries of like what the West is, and then what community or states of color, and in Africa or Southwest Asia or Asia, that somehow it's more queer phobic over there than it is here in the United States. So I just want to start naming that from the beginning of the conversation, that's not really a thing, but there is a section in the report that does talk about that of far right and ultranationalist and nationalist parties trying to make it seem like LGBTQ candidates and LGBTQ issues are foreign to the country and being imported in to destabilize the country. But I thought it was really important to start with candidates and talking about people running from internally, because it shows no, we are here. We've always been here, and we can participate in these elections. So it was so great that you started your report out that way, and to read that, and also to read about countries like Namibia who were having their first ever candidates run. It also made me think, until we lost USAID, like, how do we support them? Is there an organization that, like an international organization that specifically works? I imagine that must be so difficult now that I say that. I'm hearing myself.
There is. Yes, I mean, let me give a shout out to my friends and colleagues at the LGBTQ Victory Institute. The Victory Institute traditionally started working on elections in the US and focused on supporting LGBTIQ.
They work internationally?
They work internationally at this point. Yes, they do.
I had no idea.
Yep. So the majority of their work, as far as I'm aware, is still in the US, but they're also working internationally. One of my colleagues, who was one of the first openly gay legislators in Peru, is currently at a Victory Institute conference there with Latin American queer politicians and candidates and activists. Wow. So this work is happening in many places. It's, of course, much harder in certain parts of the world. Latin America is opening up on these issues quite quickly. Other places it's more challenging, but they're working everywhere. And we continue as Outright, as a civil society organization, to support not political candidates in a partisan sense, but LGBTIQ organizations that are trying to do political education and awareness that we hope will eventually contribute to, creating more queer candidates.
This is also helpful because for listeners, we are actually working with Victory Institute to come here to join us on the Gailey Show. And so this is good prep, because I thought we were just going to talk about national issues. And now we have a whole other area to talk about international. Do you know, when you were tabulating and finding these candidates across the globe, were there what were the issues that they were running on? Do you know that, specifically?
Yeah. So the majority of people, we were able to speak to some of them directly for our report, like the candidates in Botswana and Namibia, some of whom had come from LGBTIQ activist backgrounds. We had one of the candidates from Mexico speaking on our webinar launch of the report the other week. We've spoken to some of the candidates in Brazil, and many of them emphasize that they are running on the issues that affect the daily lives of people in their countries. And so, for instance, issues like food security, job security, these are things that people are concerned about almost everywhere, and that also are of great concern to queer and trans candidates. And this is something that our representative in Congress, Sarah McBride, here in the US, has been very vocal about, that she's there to represent the people of Delaware. She's not, necessarily there to officially represent some kind of broader trans or queer constituency. she's there to advance people's basic needs and fundamental human rights. The same was true with the candidates that we spoke with. That said, they also recognized that their identities were important and that them being out was important, right? Like, we know there have been queer people in office. I mean, dating back to monarchies, centuries ago, queer people have been in office forever, but have not been able to be open about their identities. And for almost all of the people that we spoke to or that we read about, in cases when we couldn't speak to them directly, they did make the point that they saw a symbolic value in their candidacy, and that they wanted to be a role model for others. And so we heard from a trans candidate in Pakistan, for instance, that people have certain stereotypes of what trans women are like in Pakistan. And, Pakistan is not a country that criminalizes being trans. There's a long record of recognizing what's called Khawaja Sira, which is essentially a kind of trans feminine identity that has a traditional cultural basis. But Khawaja Sira, even though they are recognized and respected and valued, have been kind of typically pigeonholed into certain activities. So, some of them are doing sex work. Some of them are working in salons. Some of them are begging for money in the streets. Some of them are in the entertainment industry. And this candidate said she wanted to show a different face of what a trans person could look like in Pakistan. So whether or not she won, was only part of the point, right? Part of the point was putting a trans person out there who was claiming her place as part of the body politic. Mm-hmm. And this was something that I just thought was beautiful and incredible, both the centering of ordinary people's issues and the recognition that one's very identity is in the spotlight and can be used to improve understanding and acceptance.
We are talking with Nia Ghoshal, who is the Senior Director of Law, Policy, and Research at Outright International. They just released a report called Queering Democracy, the Global Elections in 2024 and How LGBTQI People Fared. I have to fit in a break here. We are going to have more with Neela when we come back. You can keep the conversation going on our Blue Sky, or on Blue Sky. We are at thegaleyshow.org on Blue Sky. You are listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 KTNF and WCPTA 20 Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I am John Parker. We are coming up on the bottom of the hour. This is our weekly Thinking Queerly episode where we sit down with a guest to help us take a deep dive into an issue facing the LGBTQ and allied community. My guest today is Neela Ghoshal, the Senior Director of Law, Policy, and Research at Outright International. They just released a report called Queering Democracy, the Global Elections in 2024 and How LGBTQI People Fared. So just before the break, we were talking about candidates and how they were faring in in last year's super election year, where there were elections in 89 countries, over 1.5 billion votes were cast. For the folks voting, were there barriers to participation? Did you see a global trend of queer people having problems accessing the ballot?
Yes, we certainly did. And some of these were things that we knew before, and some of them were, that we were able to demonstrate through the research, which is always helpful to have that kind of evidence base. And we also discovered some new things that we didn't know or hadn't made the connection before. So one point that is, I think fairly obvious, but maybe important for people to think about if they haven't thought about it. In most countries around the world, it is very difficult for trans people to get official identification cards that match their gender identity, their gender expression, their name, their pronouns. And so many people are carrying around IDs that present a name and sometimes a picture that doesn't look anything like who they are. And so, of course, if ID is required to vote, as it is in many countries, that in itself can be an obstacle to voting. And this plays out in a couple ways. One is that there are actual documented cases of discrimination, of people being mocked or mistreated or misgendered, either in an aggressive way or in an unintentional way, but that still has an impact on people at the polls. Sometimes there are cases in which people are required to line up according to sex or gender. And so that's a challenging situation if you have a document that doesn't reflect who you are, or if you're a non-binary person, knowing which line to get in order to vote puts your gender identity on trial before you've even had an opportunity to participate in your democracy. So that's an issue. And the recommendation we make around that, of course, is that, there's several, but one is that countries should make it easy for people to get identification that reflects who they are. But also, even in cases where that's not possible, where that's going to take maybe years of legislative process to get laws through that do protect trans people's right to legal gender recognition, election management bodies can make clear that nobody should be stigmatized, discriminated against, or turned away from the polls because of their gender identity or expression. So that's a barrier. There are ways to address it, and some of the organizations that we talk to were working on this. Another barrier comes from the simple fact of criminalization of same-sex conduct and the risk of discrimination and violence against anybody who is queer identifying or presenting. So, in countries that have severe criminal penalties for being queer, sometimes the way in which queer people react to that is simply by not going out much, by trying to control their movements, moving within, a carefully protected space, going out at certain times of day or night, going out with people that they feel safe around. And so going to vote in elections can be dangerous if you feel like there's the risk that you will literally be picked up and arrested because of your presumed sexual conduct or your gender identity, or where there's the risk that you'll be, beat up while waiting around in line. And anti-queer violence is a huge problem around the world. One of the things that we found that was somewhat unexpected, at least to me, is that in places where it's hard to change your locality of voting, in a lot of countries around the world, a lot of queer and trans people relocate, right? They relocate to cities because it's a little bit safer. Perhaps it's more cosmopolitan. They relocate sometimes to get away from queer-phobic family members. And yet in many countries, it's difficult to change where you're registered, and you have to physically go and show up and vote in the place that you are registered, or go through a process where you go back there to change your documentation in order to register somewhere else. So for people who are, in some sense, often displaced in their own country or not safe in their original home area, there are additional obstacles to voting. And a recommendation that we made around this that would also help all kinds of categories of people is simply to make it easier and lower the administrative burden of registering to vote where you actually live.
I'm also curious about, something that's relatively new here in the US, which is actually breaking a stereotype, is that LGBTQ people have always voted for left-leaning parties. In 2020, only 60-odd% of LGBTQ identified people voted for Joe Biden, according to exit polls. This year, in 2024 rather, it was 86% of LGBTQ voters chose the Kamala Harris-Tim Walz ticket. Abroad, so where I'm going with that is that it's only relatively recently, I feel like the LGBT community is aligning with a single party and seeing their interests represented in a single party. In your report, do LGBTQ voters in a variety of countries, globally, do you see them identifying with a particular party or movement? Are they just going, you know what? They're the same. For queer people in the United States, it didn't matter if they were Democratic or Republican for a very, very long time. They were both antagonizing and demonizing the LGBTQ community. Globally in 2024, did you see the LGBTQ community coalescing around left-leaning parties, or were they just sort of staying out of the fray?
Partisan politics in other parts of the world is so much more complicated than it is in the US, right? Because parties don't often fall along kind of clearly defined ideological lines. And when they do, there's much more of a spectrum, right? So in many European countries, there's at least 7 or 8 or 9 viable parties. Some might be seen as more to the left or more to the right, but it depends on an issue-to-issue basis. I can think of, I mean, there's a number of examples here where people's voting patterns don't necessarily align with kind of traditional understandings of political interests. And I'm thinking of one of the candidates that we spoke to from Namibia, Kevin Wessels, who ran with what is considered a more right-wing Christian party. And in fact, the party itself in its platform opposes marriage equality. But, we did not, kind of interrogate specifically why this candidate was aligned with this party. But for, whatever reason, he felt that a number of his values were aligned with this party. And this is the party that he chose to run with. And another candidate in Namibia was running with a party that was seen as more progressive, another queer candidate. And I think that's exciting to see that queer people can place themselves across the political spectrum. In terms of queer voters, in many countries, there was no good option, right? And so in Ghana, for instance, our colleagues from the organization Ratify Ghana, one of the people we spoke to, Ebenezer, yes.
Can we hold that thought? I have a hard break that I've got to get to here. We'll pick it up right there when we come back. We're talking with Neela Ghoshal, who is the Senior Director of Law, Policy, and Research at Outright International. We're talking about LGBTQ people on the ballot, both candidates and voters in 2024, a super election year. You are listening to The Gailey Show. We're going to have more when we come back. Stay tuned. Coming to you from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and airing on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I am John Parker. We are already 33 minutes after the hour. It is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest for the episode to help us think more clearly and more queerly on the major issues of the day facing the LGBTQ community. Yes, there's a lot of breaking news happening. We know that. There's always seems to be that. Please stay tuned for Choose Views with Richard Chu on WCPT 820 after us. It's going to help break it all down. And on AM 950, it is the Matt McNeil Show. Today, we're talking about a report that has been released by Outright International. It's called Queering Democracy, the Global Elections in 2024 and How LGBTQI People Fared. My guest is Neela Ghoshal. Neela is the Senior Director of Law, Policy, and Research at Outright International. Prior to that, they held multiple roles at Human Rights Watch, including Associate Director of LGBT Rights and Senior Researcher on LGBT Rights. Neela, before the break, you were talking about voters in Ghana, and do you want to pick it up there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was saying that there were countries in which there was no good choice for LGBTIQ voters if they wanted to vote for a party that respected their dignity and humanity. And Ghana was really a case in point. And I was mentioning my friend Ebenezer Piga of an organization, Ratify Ghana, who described the elections in Ghana as a competition of who could be the most homophobic. And it's really astonishing. Ebenezer put together a timeline for us, which we printed in the report. Every couple weeks, one of the two main parties would accuse the other of being too LGBTIQ friendly. So one of the parties would say, that other party, they're going to decriminalize homosexuality, don't vote for them. And the other party would say, no, that party, they had trans people at their rally. You can see this footage. And they'd use either real or manipulated footage that would show people who appeared to be queer or trans at the other party's rally. And then the other party would come back and say, no, we absolutely wouldn't have queer or trans people at our rally. In fact, we want to criminalize them even further. We're backing a law that would put them in jail for this many years longer. For weeks, every couple weeks, this is what Ghanaians were hearing in their news and from their candidates. And I mean, the resilience of the partners that we work with to keep doing their work of documenting that election and educating voters, because no matter what, even though there were no good choices, they wanted queer people to get out and vote and feel that they were part of the democracy. And so they kept on doing that hard work. And ultimately, some voters felt that one of the parties was generally more friendly on human rights issues than the other, and a lot of them voted for that party. but some did not or didn't vote at all because the party that was seen as pro-human rights was still incredibly hostile toward queer issues. So it doesn't break it down neatly. There are some countries in South Asia where trans people are recognized, but gay people are not, right? And so there might be some trans groups that were aligned with a ruling party, for instance. This was the case in India, to some extent in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and then other queer people who felt completely not represented by that party and were pushing for something new.
Mm-hmm. It gives Nick Fuentes and Gropers versus MAGA, where they're trying to outdo each other. Nancy Mace here in the U.S. is constantly trying to prove that she's the most anti-trans congressperson in the United States, and everybody else is sort of, going
she
for that.
She would fit right in Ghana.
And also there is this, you were talking about a candidate who was running on the right, and it blows my mind here that in the United States, the Trump administration has more queer people serving than any other administration in U.S. history. There was just a New York Times article about that. And there's a candidate for lieutenant governor in Virginia who is, openly gay and running for lieutenant governor on the Republican, talk show host, MAGA, all of that. They tried to kick him out of the party and get him to get off the ballot. He said no. I mean, it's happening here as well as other places. And where I'm going with that is US style MAGA rhetoric, campaign messaging seemed to be going out to other countries in the world where they were looking at what Trump was doing. They were looking at what MAGA was doing here in the States and going, ooh, we can take that too. That's my impression of it. I sort of read that as well in the report. Can you unpack that for us? And, it was were other countries looking to what MAGA and Trump were doing and saying, yes, please?
Yes, many of them certainly were. And it's not, it's not a one-way flow of ideas and information. It's a complex world where a lot of these things are globalized. And some of the hostile rhetoric that we were hearing against queer people in these elections, we were hearing years ago in Brazil, right? We started to hear about gender ideology. The whole kind of diluted concept of gender ideology came first from the Vatican. But then it went to countries like Hungary and Brazil before it really became popularized in the United States. But in 2024, in dozens of countries around the world, usually parties that were to the right were using terms like gender ideology to try to stigmatize queer and trans people. We heard the word woke get globalized and used in a few different elections, including in countries where you can't really pronounce the word woke or wokeism. I mean, I speak French and Spanish. You can't really pronounce wokeism in those languages, but it's being adopted because it is something that people have seized upon to dehumanize a group of people and or a set of beliefs. And what we found overall out of the 60 countries, of the 89 countries that had elections, we were able to monitor them fairly closely in 60. And in those 60 countries, there were 51 cases where there were documented instances of anti-LGBTIQ rhetoric during the elections. It's like an epidemic. And I think this is also really important for people to understand that when they hear this kind of stuff, it's not new, it's not innovative, and it's not even attuned to the real needs and issues of people locally. It's something that is circulating globally, that is popularized by extremely well-funded right-wing organizations. And it's part of the politics of demonizing and scapegoating others. So I think we saw that in the 2024 elections in a way that we never have before. And part of how I think about this, to be honest, is there are a lot of parties that have they don't really have a platform. They don't really have a politics, but they want, parties and politicians, they're looking for an issue. And they realize that when they can scare people, when they can create moral panic, they don't have to prove that they're actually capable of accomplishing anything that is constructive or will improve the lives of people. And that's what was happening in a lot of these elections. Parties and politicians with no plan, no agenda, no, real ability to advance reform in their country. And so their politics was a politics of hate.
Mm. So I got a lot to say about that. But I something else that I saw in the report that was really speaking to me of my own lived experiences. So I'm Armenian American, and on my mom's side is the entire Armenian family, and they were, survivors of the Armenian genocide. They're all in France now, which is how I'm a French U.S. citizen. But something that's unique outside of the European, I feel like, in American context, is that when you come out as queer in the United States, you don't stop being American. You don't stop being Swedish. You don't stop being Canadian. You don't stop being French. But in Armenian context, and in a number of other countries in the world, if you come out as queer, suddenly you're not part of, like, had folks that have been very clear, like, you're not Armenian anymore. And they've said that very point blank to me. And they have accused me of being, trying to destabilize the Republic of Armenia by trying to promote, LGBTQ people and, books and films and culture and whatnot. That I am somehow an international threat coming in to destabilize the country to allow other countries like Azerbaijan and Turkey to go in there and, obliterate Armenia. This came up in the report about particular parties, movements that were expressing the same thing. Can you unpack that for us about how these countries are identifying LGBTQ people as a threat to national security, a threat to the country itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, sort of odd and contradictory phenomenon, but it's something that exists in many, many places. The reality of anti-LGBTIQ laws in most countries is that those were imported by foreign colonizers. So the British Empire was the biggest perpetrator in this regard. It inflicted laws criminalizing so-called carnal knowledge against the order of nature in dozens of countries that it colonized, ranging from Southern and East Africa to South Asia to the Caribbean. And, to some extent, not quite as much, the French did the same. So there's these histories of colonization, and colonization was partly a battle for control, social control. And part of the way that you control people is by controlling their sexuality and their gender. And so this became a kind of tried and true colonial strategy. And unfortunately, because of, I think, the way that history has played out and the fact that a lot of quote unquote Western countries, have at this point a 50 or 60-year history of queer rights advocacy. We had Stonewall, we had the whole series of, development of pride movements that stemmed from that. That didn't necessarily surge up at the same time and in the same way in post-colonial states. The fact that these movements are emerging at a later time in a number of post-colonial states has allowed opportunistic politicians to falsely brand these as Western movements and to brand queer identities as Western identities. And so this is something that activist groups on the ground that I work with are constantly pushing back against. In Southern Africa, the groups are unearthing a lot of the history of cave paintings that showed same-sex acts centuries ago. In Indonesia and in the Pacific, there's a long history of multiple gender identities, sometimes 5 genders in some traditional cultures, like the Bisu in Indonesia. And politicians want to kind of whitewash that history and claim that anything that is queer from a perspective of sexuality and gender is a foreign import. And they do that not because it's true or that there's any evidence for it, but because it's a strategy to scapegoat a group of people, which is, again, what a lot of politicians want to do. So this came up constantly in these elections and in so many different places. In Mauritius, which also just decriminalized same-sex conduct with a beautiful court judgment that noted that these were colonial foreign laws. Nonetheless, there were politicians that were saying during the election campaign that homosexuality was a Western deviation. This was happening in Senegal as well. It was happening in Uruguay. It was happening in Hungary. So the number of countries in which politicians were resorting to this kind of rhetoric was really, kind of astonishing and disturbing. And again, kind of a wake-up call for voters that this candidate is not relying on facts, information, or anything that is, that is locally tethered. They're importing strategies to attack and divide.
And it also, I mean, it shows up, and the thing that so frustrates me, and I'm going to just speak to my Armenian experience, is how many, American LGBTQ folks, like in Armenia, we don't even say, that's not even how we say our country, right? It's Hayastan. And, I remember how many times what I say to, my American white American friends that were like, oh, you're from a Stan country? Just let it go. That's hopeless. You know what I mean? And so it's like this weird, like, reinforcement of, which is why I wanted to mention earlier, this dynamic, and thank you for giving us the history of that, like, Western colonial Britain, France, taking that homophobia, taking that queerphobia, criminalizing it. And I thought that was very interesting how you pointed out that once those laws start to fall, then queer people find themselves participating in electoral politics and able to sort of shift the narratives. And I think that that's something that I've found so encouraging about your report, is that you're able to begin highlighting the candidates that are running, highlighting the issues, and showing how we can move forward. And I want to talk about moving forward because you've got very specific recommendations in your report of what folks can be doing in various countries to support the LGBT community at the ballot, both as candidates and as voters. We're going to take a break and we're going to talk more about that. We are here with Neela Ghoshal, Senior Director of Law, Policy, and Research at Outright International. You are listening to The Gailey Show on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota, and WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk where facts matter. More after the break. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I'm John Parker. We are coming up on the top of the hour. We are talking about a new report from Outright International. It's called Queering Democracy, the Global Elections in 2024 and How LGBTIQ People Fared. With us is Neela Ghoshal, the Senior Director of Law, Policy, and Research at Outright International. Very important section of the report, Neela, is recommendations based on all of the research that you compiled about what happened in 2024 elections. Can we start to break down these recommendations of what individual countries can be doing to support both candidates and LGBTQ voters?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, part of the good news of a report like this is that there is a lot that can be done. And in many countries, some of this work is happening already. And so we can predict that in the coming years, LGBTIQ people will continue to be stigmatized during elections. It's political fodder. But we need to be pushing for policies that will protect us and protect our right to vote, protect our right to run for office, protect our right to participate in our democracies. So some of our recommendations are to election management bodies. So the organizations that are actually running the elections, election bodies do voter outreach. They try to educate people about where they can vote, when they can vote, and they can and should be reaching out to specific constituencies, including LGBTIQ people, to make sure they know how to vote, to make sure that they know how to vote safely. Mm-hmm. And they also need to be talking to civil society organizations that have concrete recommendations to be made about how the whole process can be safer for queer people. So what happened in Romania, for instance, was that there was a lot of queerphobia happening during the election, but there was this really positive engagement between organizations like Accept Romania, which is a queer organization, and the election management body about how to put in place really good guidelines so that the polling officers, knew that they were not allowed to discriminate against trans people in particular. And so that kind of work, putting in place guidelines to make sure that discrimination doesn't take place at the polls, and that in the process leading up to the elections that queer people can get registered, that they have the right documentation, that they're able to vote, is crucial. There are a lot of organizations out there that do the important work of monitoring and kind of assessing the validity of elections. And so they report on whether elections were free and fair. And there's a lot of different metrics that are used. And those metrics sometimes include whether particular groups are excluded, whether it's safe for people to go and vote in different parts of the country, if the country is at war, or if there's been a natural disaster and people can't get to the polls, the election might not be as free and fair. Or if people are being bribed or threatened for or against voting for a particular candidate. Something else that makes the election not 100% free and fair is if queer people cannot safely vote and participate as candidates. So this is something that we urge these election monitoring bodies, which are both governmental and non-governmental organizations, to take into account in their metrics and in their recommendations to governments. We encourage political parties to take up LGBTIQ issues in a positive way. Many of them were in the 2024 elections, and that was exciting to see. Groups were reaching out and saying, we want to see what's in your platform that will concretely improve our lives. So political parties need to listen to voters. They need to take those issues on board. And political parties that want to be truly representative need to ensure that they have queer people within their own governing bodies, that their political platform is being designed by groups that are diverse and that represent the experiences of queer people. And then we're encouraging LGBTIQ organizations themselves to do this hard work, as challenging as it is, to continue to do the hard work like the colleagues in Ghana were doing, of monitoring the elections every day, reporting on irregularities. And finally, donors are important in this whole process. And you mentioned at some point that USAID used to do this work. We don't have USAID anymore. It was right down the street from where I am right now in DC. We miss it badly, but there are governments around the world that are investing in democracy and good governance, and they need to ensure, and some of those governments are also investing in LGBTIQ human rights, and they need to make sure they don't keep these two issues separate. Work needs to be done at this intersection in order to ensure that democracies are fully inclusive. And of course, there are non-governmental donors out there as well, philanthropists, corporations, individuals. We would love to see them funding work at these intersections. I'm going to make one last mention of the UN, because right now UNGA is happening this week in New York. So all the countries are meeting. And every couple of years, the UN usually issues a resolution at the General Assembly that's called the Elections Resolution. And it's basically a resolution whereby countries are committing to upholding free and fair elections. In previous years, it was always the US that sponsored that resolution, and they did at some point begin adding language about how nobody should be discriminated against in access to elections, including on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So they also, listed race, ethnicity, other factors that might result in discrimination. I would like countries at the UN, regardless of how, progressive or not they are on the whole range of LGBTIQ issues, to accept this as a bottom line, that nobody should be prevented from voting or participating in their democracy because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Because once you start excluding people from your democracy, the democracy no longer has value.
What an excellent place to leave our conversation today. I can't even believe, how is the hour over already? Neela, thank you so much for joining me today. You at home or in your car, wherever you're listening right now, you can read this report for yourself. And also on their website, it's so brilliant. They've got it broken down by bullet points as well. So if you can't dive into the full report, you can go to outrightinternational.org. Also, if you really want to get into it, they have some beautiful case studies from dozens of countries of looking specifically at what was happening in them. So you can find that report at outrightinternational.org. Neela, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for your time.
I'm probably going to be reaching out again.
Absolutely.
There was so much still to unpack, and in the work that you're doing also internationally. All right, folks, thank you for joining us today. Up next on WCPT 820 is Choose Views with Richard Chu. On AM 950 Radio, it is the Matt McNeil Show. Stay tuned after that for Native Roots Radio. And then at 10 p.m. Central, step into the unknown with Ghost Box Radio. And until tomorrow, folks, keep it queer, America.